The farmhouse sat where the land flattened and stretched, a lone structure pressed between pale winter fields and a thin line of leafless trees that marked the old boundary of the property. It was not large, not grand, and certainly not new. Its boards had gone silver with age, and the roof sagged just enough to show the years had not been gentle. Yet what caught attention, what unsettled people, was not how old it looked, but what it lacked. There was no chimney. In a region where winter arrived early and stayed late, where frost crept into bone and breath turned sharp before October was done, a house without a fireplace was not merely unusual. It was foolish. Dangerous, even. When the first cold winds swept down from the north and dusted the fields with ice, neighbors slowed their wagons as they passed, eyes lingering on the roofline, searching for a chimney that never appeared. They shook their heads and moved on, confident that nature would soon correct such an error. The woman who lived there had arrived quietly the previous spring. No announcement, no celebration, just a single wagon, a few pieces of furniture, and a life that looked like it had already been lived hard before it reached that place. She repaired the fence herself, planted late crops that most assumed would fail, and kept to her work without inviting questions. People learned her name only because they needed something to call her when they spoke about her at the general store. Her name was Eleanor. By late autumn, when other homes stacked cordwood high and repaired their chimneys, Eleanor did neither. She brought no firewood from the forest. No coal deliveries arrived at her gate. There was no smell of burning oak or pine drifting from her house at night. Her windows stayed dark, and yet she did not leave. When the first snow fell, the farmhouse remained. It was after that snowfall that people noticed the smoke. It appeared early in the morning, before the sun had fully lifted the frost from the ground. Thin and gray, it slid low across the yard behind the house, not rising into the sky as smoke should, but spreading outward like fog. It did not billow or thicken. It did not stain the air with sharpness. It simply moved slow, steady, deliberate before thinning and disappearing somewhere beyond the far edge of the property. At first, people assumed she was burning trash. Old boards, perhaps. Crop waste. The kind of fire that didn't last long and didn't mean much. But the smoke came again the next morning. And the next. And then again in the evening, always at the same hours, always the same strange behavior, never climbing, never darkening, never drifting upward to a chimney that did not exist. Children noticed it first, because children always do. They pointed from sleds and wagons, asking why the smoke was crawling instead of flying. Adults told them not to stare, that some things were not their concern. Still, eyes followed the gray trail whenever it appeared. As the cold deepened, something else became impossible to ignore. Eleanor did not freeze. While other homes cracked under the stress of winter pipes groaning, windows icing over from the inside, floors turning so cold they burned the soles of feet, her farmhouse remained unchanged. Snow melted faster near its foundation. Frost retreated from her doorstep even on the coldest mornings. When she opened her door, no blast of icy air rushed out. Instead, a soft warmth escaped, subtle but unmistakable. Neighbors noticed because they were looking for failure. They expected to see her leave, bundled and defeated, seeking shelter in town. They expected illness, desperation, a mistake corrected too late. Instead, they saw her walking the fields with steady steps, her posture relaxed, her breath calm. She did not wear extra layers. She did not rush. This unsettled them more than the smoke ever had. Speculation grew in small, quiet ways. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Some suggested she must have hidden a stove somewhere inside, though no one had seen smoke rise from the roof. Others guessed she slept fully clothed beneath piles of blankets, enduring misery in silence. A few claimed the house was haunted, warmed by something unnatural, though they laughed as they said it, unwilling to believe their own words. Eleanor offered no explanation. When neighbors stopped by under the polite excuse of checking on her, they were met with courtesy, but little else. She did not invite them inside. She stood at the doorway, framed by shadow and warmth, listening calmly, answering briefly, declining assistance with a small smile that carried no apology. "I am fine," she said again and again. The smoke continued. By midwinter, it became a kind of clock. People knew the hour by its appearance. Morning smoke meant dawn chores. Evening smoke meant the day was closing. It was as reliable as any bell and far stranger. One morning, after a night so cold it split fence posts and turned breath to crystals, a neighbor noticed something that shifted the unease into something closer to fear. His boots sank deep into snow as he crossed his own yard, and the cold cut through his coat as if it were paper. But as he passed Eleanor's property line, the air changed, not dramatically, not enough to explain away his imagination, just enough to feel. The cold eased. It was subtle, a difference of degrees rather than a sudden warmth, but undeniable. The ground felt less hostile beneath his boots, the air less sharp. Snow near the house looked different, settled instead of brittle, softened as if it had been touched by a gentler hand. He did not cross the fence. He did not call out. He simply stood there, watching the faint smoke slide along the ground, and felt something he could not name. Respect came later. At first, there was only confusion, suspicion, and a growing discomfort that came from not understanding something that should have been simple. Fire was fire. Heat came from flame. Smoke went up. Everyone knew that. Everyone always had. Except here, where smoke moved sideways and heat stayed hidden. The farmhouse remained silent through the longest nights of winter. No crackle of burning logs. No glow of firelight through the windows. Only that low, gray smoke, appearing and disappearing like a secret the land itself was keeping. And slowly, without anyone realizing exactly when it happened, the question shifted. It was no longer how Eleanor would survive the winter. It was how she already had. Eleanor woke before the light, as she always did, not because the cold demanded it, but because her body had learned a rhythm that no longer belonged to clocks. The house around her was quiet, settled, holding its warmth the way earth holds heat long after the sun has gone. The air did not bite her skin when she pulled the quilt aside. The floor beneath her bare feet was not kind, exactly, but it was not cruel either. It carried a dull, steady warmth that rose slowly, patiently, as if it had nowhere else it needed to be. She moved through the room without lighting a lamp. The dark was familiar. The house knew her steps, and she knew its silences. When she set water on the small table near the window, it did not frost the way it did in other homes by that time of year. Steam rose lazily when she warmed it, curling in the dimness before disappearing. There was no iron stove to tend, no ash to clean, no sudden flare of flame that needed watching. Heat here did not demand attention. It simply existed. This was how she liked it. When Eleanor had first returned to the farmhouse, she had stood in the center of the main room and listened. Not to sounds, but to absence. The place had been empty for years, long enough that mice had learned its corners and wind had learned its cracks. The old hearth was still there, bricked up and sealed, a blackened memory of fires that once roared too hot and too fast. She had placed her palm against that wall and felt nothing useful in it. Fire, she knew, could be wasteful when handled without patience. She had not come back to relive the past. She had come to finish something that had been left unfinished. The first weeks were spent beneath the house, in earth that had not been disturbed since her grandfather's time. She worked alone, quietly, digging and clearing, uncovering stones placed with intention rather than convenience. The tunnels were there, just as she remembered them from childhood stories told in half-phrases and warnings. Smoke paths, her grandfather had called them, though he had never explained more than that. Heat likes to travel, he used to say. You just have to give it somewhere worth going. Most people burned wood to chase warmth. Eleanor had learned to invite it instead. By the time winter arrived, the system was ready. It did not look like much from the outside. A shallow pit behind the house, a low structure of stone and clay that barely rose above the ground. No chimney, no spectacle. The fire she built there was never large. It smoldered rather than blazed, fed with crop waste, dried stalks, twisted branches that no one else bothered to collect. She lit it slowly, carefully, at the same hours each day, letting the heat begin its journey beneath the farmhouse. The smoke followed. It moved through stone-lined channels under the floors, along the walls, winding through the house like blood through veins. By the time it reached the far outlet, its heat had already been surrendered, soaked into stone and wood and packed earth. What emerged on the other side was only the ghost of what had entered, cooler, thinner, harmless. Eleanor never watched the smoke leave. She did not need to. She could feel its work under her feet. Inside, life continued at a pace that did not match the urgency of winter beyond her walls. She cooked slowly, taking her time with meals that lasted her days. She mended clothing without rushing, hands steady, needle guided by habit rather than haste. She slept through nights that others endured in fragments, waking only when her body told her it had rested enough. Outside, the world strained. Woodpiles shrank faster than expected. Chimneys clogged and cracked under sudden temperature shifts. Houses built to impress rather than endure groaned in protest, their straight lines and thin walls surrendering heat as quickly as it was produced. People learned the sound of their own home suffering, learned to listen for warning in the night. And still, Eleanor S. Farmhouse remained unchanged. Neighbors noticed details long before they admitted noticing anything at all. Snow melted in uneven patches near her foundation. Animals lingered where they should not have, drawn by something they could not see but could feel. Even the air seemed reluctant to linger too close to her walls. as if it had already been used for something more important. A woman from the next property over walked past one afternoon and paused without meaning to. She stood there longer than she intended, arms folded against the cold, eyes fixed on the farmhouse. There was no smoke then, no movement, just the quiet certainty that something was wrong with the picture she was seeing. Houses without chimneys were supposed to be cold, empty, temporary. This one was none of those things. When Eleanor opened the door to take in a delivery she hadn't, T asked for a small bundle of firewood, left by someone too polite to attach their name. The warmth escaped again, soft and slow. It was not the sharp heat of a roaring fire. It did not rush or push. It drifted, brushing the air like a reminder. "Are you sure you, Don, need more?" The neighbor asked, voice carrying the awkwardness of someone hoping to be refused. Eleanor smiled, just enough. "I am sure." She carried the wood inside anyway, not because she needed it, but because refusing it outright would only sharpen curiosity. She stacked it neatly in a corner where it would remain untouched. The smoke appeared again that evening, right on time. Children sledding down a nearby slope watched it with narrowed eyes, their laughter fading into quiet as they followed its path. One of them dared another to get close. None of them did. The smoke felt wrong, somehow not dangerous, not threatening, just intentional. Like it belonged exactly where it was and nowhere else. Adults pretended not to see it, which was worse. Rumors filled the spaces where certainty failed. Some said Eleanor had found a way to trap heat inside the walls. Others claimed she had sealed the house so tightly that air itself had nowhere to go. A few whispered about old knowledge, about things people used to do before convenience replaced understanding. Those voices were usually dismissed first. Eleanor heard none of it, or pretended not to. She had learned long ago that explanations offered too early were never accepted. People needed to be ready to listen, and winter had a way of preparing them. On the coldest night of the season, when the moon hung sharp and white and the stars felt close enough to cut, Eleanor slept deeply. The house held its warmth without complaint. Beneath the floors, stone released what it had gathered, all day, slow and steady, like a breath exhaled over hours instead of seconds. Far away, chimneys smoked hard against the sky, fighting to stay ahead of the cold. In Eleanor's yard, no smoke rose at all, and inside the farmhouse heat moved silently, doing exactly what it had been taught to do. The first person to follow the smoke did not intend to. It happened by accident, the way most turning points do. A man named Thomas Avery had lived beside those fields for nearly 20 years, long enough to believe he understood the land better than most. He knew how wind behaved there, how snow gathered in hollows and scoured hilltops clean. He knew where water froze first and where it lingered. He prided himself on knowing such things, on being able to predict them with a glance. That morning when he stepped out into the cold and saw the smoke sliding low across Eleanor's yard, something in him resisted turning away. The wind was wrong for it. Smoke should have lifted, thinned, scattered. This did none of that. It moved with purpose, hugging the ground as if guided, bending gently where it should have broken apart. Thomas told himself he was imagining things, that exhaustion and cold had sharpened his curiosity into foolishness. Still, his feet carried him forward, boots crunching softly through the snow. He stayed on his side of the fence at first, tracing the smoke with his eyes. It drifted from behind the farmhouse, spreading outward in a shallow arc, before narrowing again, disappearing near a cluster of stones half buried at the far edge of the property. He frowned. Those stones had always been there, remnants of something old and forgotten. No one paid them much mind. Thomas waited. The smoke did not thicken. It did not grow acrid. It did not sting his nose the way smoke should. It cooled as it traveled, losing urgency rather than gaining it. When it finally vanished, there was no lingering smell, no haze hanging in the air. Against his better judgment, he crossed the fence. The cold bit harder on Eleanor's side of the property, not because it was colder, but because he expected it to be warmer and found the difference subtler than he wanted. He walked slowly, following the faint trace left behind, careful not to leave deep impressions in the snow. Near the back of the house, he saw it. The fire pit. It was small, far smaller than any outdoor fire meant for warmth. Stone-lined and shallow, with darkened earth around it and a neat arrangement of fuel stacked nearby. There were no towering flames, no roaring blaze. What burned there was restrained, deliberate. A low fire, fed just enough to smolder. Smoke slipped away from it not in wild plumes, but in a controlled stream, guided immediately into a narrow opening at ground level. Thomas crouched, heart beating faster than the situation seemed to warrant. The opening was lined with stone, smooth and blackened, leading away beneath the house. He could feel warmth radiating from it, not fierce, but constant. It was the kind of heat that did. T announced itself, that did. T threatened to burn. only to persist. He straightened slowly, a realization forming that unsettled him more than any ghost story could have. The smoke was, tea escaping. It was being used. Thomas did not knock on Eleanor's door. He did not call out. He left the way he came, stepping carefully, his mind working harder than his body had all winter. By the time he reached his own yard, he felt as though he had stumbled onto something private, something not meant to be witnessed before it was understood. He told no one that day, but silence does not last long in small places. Within a week, others began noticing details they could no longer ignore. The snow melted in narrow lines along Eleanor's foundation, revealing faint ridges beneath. When frost crept across roofs elsewhere, her windows remained clear. Animals lingered where they shouldn't have, drawn not to food or shelter, but to warmth rising from the ground itself. Someone else followed the smoke, then another. Soon it was no longer a secret that there was something beneath that farmhouse. They came cautiously at first, pretending coincidence, careful not to admit curiosity. No one crossed the threshold of Eleanor's home. They circled it instead, like wary animals around unfamiliar fire. They noted the subtle dips in the earth, the way the ground had been packed and repacked, the unnatural smoothness of certain stone placements. Speculation sharpened into theory. She's running the smoke under the house. Someone finally said aloud, voice low, as if the words themselves might object. Others scoffed at first. Smoke was dangerous. Everyone knew that. It poisoned, suffocated, killed. You did to invite it into your home, not unless you wanted blackened walls and lungs full of regret. But then came the evidence, the lack of soot, the absence of smell, the steady warmth that did tea fluctuate with the size of the fire. It was tea smoke she was keeping. It was heat. One afternoon, Thomas returned to the fire pit, this time not alone. He brought with him a neighbor older than the rest, a man whose hands bore the thickened scars of decades of work. The old man said nothing at first, crouching near the pit, studying the stones, tracing the edges with careful fingers. "This isn't new," he finally murmured. Thomas looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean it is old. Older than this place. Older than us." The man tapped one of the stones gently. "People used to do this. Not like this exactly, but close enough. Slow fires, long paths, letting the house drink the heat before letting the smoke go. Why do they stop?" Thomas asked. The old man snorted softly. "Because it takes patience, and knowledge, and time. 3 things people are always convinced they can replace with more fuel." Word spread faster after that. People began to understand that what Eleanor had done was not magic, nor madness, nor defiance of nature. It was cooperation. She wasn't forcing heat into her home. She was guiding it, slowing it down, giving it reason to stay. Some felt embarrassed, others defensive. They remembered the jokes made early in the season, the pitying looks, the assumptions spoken too freely. They remembered offering firewood not out of generosity, but out of quiet superiority. Now, standing in homes that bled warmth, as quickly as they produced it, they felt the sting of having dismissed something they did not understand. Eleanor noticed the change without acknowledging it. She saw people walking her fence line more often, standing longer near the stones where smoke vanished. She heard voices lower when she passed. Questions hovered in the air, but rarely found the courage to land. When someone finally asked, truly asked, it was not with accusation, but with awe. "How did you do it?" A neighbor said one evening, voice stripped of pretense. Eleanor considered him for a long moment before answering. "I did to do it," she said calmly. "I remembered it." That answer did not satisfy everyone, but it was enough. As winter tightened its grip, the farmhouse became something else entirely. No longer an oddity, no longer a curiosity. It became a quiet benchmark against which other homes were measured. People noticed how little fuel she used, how rarely the fire pit needed tending, how evenly the warmth spread, without drafts or cold corners. They noticed, too, that the smoke never lingered inside, that it emerged clean, spent, harmless. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The smoke was not waste. It was work. And beneath Eleanor's floors, beneath stone and earth and memory, heat moved with purpose, teaching a lesson that winter had made impossible to ignore. Understanding rarely arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, shaped by need and sharpened by consequence. By the time winter reached its hardest edge, the neighbors no longer questioned whether Eleanor's farmhouse was warm. That truth had become undeniable. What unsettled them now was why it worked when everything they trusted was failing. The first chimney cracked on a night when the wind screamed hard enough to shake shutters loose. The fire inside had been fed too quickly, too desperately, as if force alone could overpower the cold. The stone split with a sharp sound that echoed through the darkness, and smoke spilled back into the room where a family slept. They woke coughing, scrambling, dragging children outside into the snow with blankets thrown over their shoulders. By morning, word had spread, and with it came fear not of cold, but of fire itself. Eleanor heard the story in passing, delivered with shaking hands and tired eyes. She listened without comment, nodding once, as though the outcome had always been waiting patiently for its turn. In her farmhouse, the air remained calm. The walls were warm to the touch, not hot, not threatening. There was no single source of heat demanding attention, no flame to fear or worship. The warmth did not roar. It lingered. That difference mattered more now than it had earlier in the season. People began to notice how evenly her house held its temperature. In their own homes, rooms closest to the stove became unbearable while corners remained icy. Night meant constant tending, adding fuel, adjusting dampers, waking to check for smoke. Sleep came in pieces. Exhaustion layered itself over everything. Eleanor slept through the night. The realization that her method required less effort, not more, unsettled those who had always equated struggle with survival. They had believed winter was meant to be fought. Eleanor treated it as something to be endured, guided, respected. The old man who had recognized the stone channels returned one afternoon, walking slowly, his breath visible in the cold. Eleanor saw him coming and met him outside, not out of defense but out of courtesy. He did not ask to come in. He only looked at the ground near her feet, at the way snow refused to stay frozen there. "You rebuilt it properly?" he said at last. Eleanor inclined her head. "I tried." He nodded, as if confirming something long suspected. Most people rush the fire. They think more flame means more warmth. But heat does like to be rushed. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It likes to be given time." They stood in silence for a moment, two people speaking a language that did not require many words. Then he sighed, at a sound heavy with memory. "My father talked about this once," he said. Said his grandfather used something similar. But when fuel became cheap, no one bothered anymore. Faster was better, easier, they said. "And safer," Eleanor added gently. He smiled without humor. So they thought. By then, embarrassment had settled into the community like an unspoken fog. People remembered the looks they had shared, the certainty with which they had judged a house without a chimney. They remembered offering help that had been more about proving themselves right than helping at all. Pride made some turn away, pretending nothing had changed. Others leaned into curiosity, asking questions they would have mocked months earlier. "How do you keep the smoke from backing up? What if the channels clog? Does it take more work to build?" Eleanor answered when asked, carefully, without flourish. She explained the slope of the channels, the importance of slow airflow, the way stone absorbed heat best when it was shocked by sudden flame. She spoke of maintenance as something done once, properly, rather than endlessly, desperately. Not everyone liked what they heard. It required planning, patience, a willingness to accept that the fastest solution was rarely the best one. Some people preferred to believe her farmhouse was an exception, not a lesson. Then the prices rose. Wood became scarce as demand outpaced supply. Coal shipments slowed. People began counting logs the way they once counted days. Fires were fed reluctantly now, each added piece a small calculation, each flame watched with suspicion. Eleanor's fire pit consumed what others ignored: dried stalks, twisted branches, agricultural waste. Things that burned poorly in open stoves but smoldered perfectly in a controlled fire. Her fuel cost almost nothing because it had already been dismissed as useless. That fact cut deeper than any lecture could have. One by one, neighbors began arriving with different postures than before. They did not come offering help. They came asking for it. Some were awkward, others blunt, a few clearly uncomfortable with the reversal of roles. Eleanor treated them all the same. She showed them the channels beneath the house, lifting a section of floor where stone lay warm and dry. She traced the path smoke took, from fire pit to foundation to far outlet. She explained how heat lingered in stone, how walls could be taught to hold warmth instead of surrendering it. "This isn't about copying what I did," she told them. "Your houses are different. Your land is different. You have to listen to it." Some nodded, some frowned. A few truly listened. Those who listened survived winter with less fear. They learned to burn slower, to trust delayed warmth, to stop chasing comfort and start cultivating it. They learned that smoke, when respected, could be a tool rather than a threat. They learned that fire did not have to dominate a space to warm it. Not everyone made the change in time. There were more cracked chimneys, more near misses, more nights spent shivering because fuel ran out too soon. Each failure reinforced the lesson winter was already teaching. Eleanor never said, "I told you so." She did. She need to. By the time the worst of winter passed, The farmhouse had become something else entirely in the collective mind of the community. It was no longer strange. It was instructive. A reminder that knowledge did not disappear just because it fell out of fashion. People spoke differently now, quieter, more thoughtful. They spoke of heat as something that could be managed, not merely produced. Of homes as systems, not shelters slapped together in defiance of weather. And when they looked at Eleanor, they no longer saw a woman who had risked foolishness. They saw someone who had remembered what others had chosen to forget. The smoke still appeared, low and steady, morning and evening. But now it was watched with understanding rather than suspicion. It no longer raised questions. It raised respect. Winter did not loosen its grip just because people had learned something. It pressed harder, as if offended by the sudden shift in understanding. Storms came closer together now, piling snow upon snow until fences disappeared and paths had to be rediscovered each morning. The cold settled deep, not sharp anymore, but heavy, a constant weight that refused to lift. It was the kind of winter that exposed weaknesses quickly and punished hesitation without mercy. By then, the community had split in quiet ways. There were those who had listened to Eleanor, who had walked her grounds and watched her work with careful attention. They had not copied her exactly, she had warned them against that, but they had adapted what they could. They slowed their fires. They redirected airflow. Some dug shallow channels beneath their floors, imperfect but thoughtful. Others lined walls with stone, learning how mass could hold warmth long after flame died down. Their homes were not as steady as Eleanor's farmhouse, but they were better than before. Their fires lasted longer. Their fuel stretched farther. Most importantly, their fear eased. And then there were those who had not listened. Pride kept some from asking. Habit trapped others. A few simply believed winter would break before their supplies did, the way it always had. They burned hotter and faster, feeding their stoves with growing desperation as woodpiles shrank. They slept lightly, waking often, haunted by the sound of shifting air and cracking stone. The difference became visible. On the coldest mornings, smoke from some chimneys rose thick and frantic, dark against the pale sky. From others, it drifted lighter, slower, carrying less heat away with it. Eleanor could tell, just by looking, who had learned to let warmth stay. People began coming to her house, not just with questions, but with stories. Small confessions offered quietly, as if admitting weakness to winter-required privacy. A man spoke of waking to ice on his bedroom walls before he changed the way he burned. A woman admitted she had nearly lost her stove to overheating before she slowed her fire and lined the surrounding stone. Eleanor listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was never in absolutes. She did promise comfort. She did offer guarantees. She spoke of balance, of watching how heat moved and learning when to stop forcing it, of accepting that warmth was something you managed, not something you conquered. In her own farmhouse, life continued with its quiet consistency. She still lit her fire at the same hours, still fed it carefully, still let the smoke take its long path beneath the house. The system did not require adjustment for the harsher cold. It responded naturally, releasing more heat, simply because the difference between inside and out had grown greater. The stone gave what it had stored. The earth did the rest. That more than anything impressed those who had tried to improve their own homes. They had expected her to struggle when the cold worsened. They waited for signs of stress, more smoke, longer fires, signs of urgency. None came. Her warmth was not reactive. It was prepared. As supplies dwindled, a subtle shift took place. Fuel stopped being the measure of security. Knowledge became the currency that mattered. Those who understood how to stretch heat found themselves in better shape than those with larger woodpiles and no plan. One evening, a small group arrived at Eleanor's farmhouse together. They did not crowd her. They stood at a respectful distance, hands tucked into coats, breath visible in the fading light. This time, there was no awkwardness in their posture, no pretense. "We're not asking you to build anything for us," one of them said. "We just want to understand what we are missing." Eleanor studied their faces. She saw exhaustion there, and humility, and something else that mattered more, willingness. She nodded once and invited them to walk with her. She showed them where heat lingered longest, how stone felt different when it had been allowed to warm slowly. She explained why her fire never flared, why smoke never rushed. She spoke of patience not as a virtue, but as a practical tool, something you could use the way you used a shovel or an axe. Winter listened, but it did not object. Storms continued. Cold nights stretched on. And still, fewer people panicked. Fewer fires burned out of control. Fewer homes failed. By the time the days began to lengthen, almost without anyone noticing, the community had changed in a way that could not be undone. They no longer treated heat as an emergency response. They treated it as part of the house itself. Eleanor's farmhouse remained at the center of that shift, not because she demanded attention, but because it offered proof. Proof that winter did not always have to be survived at the edge of desperation. Some lessons were learned just in time. Others arrived a little too late. But all of them arrived because the cold had forced people to finally see what had been there all along. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It crept in the way warmth always did when it was allowed to move at its own pace. Snow receded in patches first, dark earth showing through like remembered ground rather than something newly revealed. Streams loosened and began to speak again, quiet at first, then more confidently as days passed. Winter did not vanish so much as it withdrew, leaving behind the evidence of what it had tested. By then, the smoke no longer drew attention. It still appeared behind Eleanor's farmhouse, thin and steady, but no one stopped to watch it anymore. It had become familiar, understood. Children no longer pointed. Adults no longer speculated. The smoke had lost its mystery because it had earned trust. Eleanor noticed the change in subtler ways. People waved now when they passed, not out of politeness alone but recognition. Conversations lingered longer at the edges of her property. Questions came less often, replaced by observations shared like quiet victories. How a new stone wall held warmth through a cold snap, how a slower fire meant deeper sleep, how fewer logs had been needed this winter than the last. None of it surprised her. She spent her days tending to the land as she always had, turning soil where frost had loosened it, repairing what winter had strained. Beneath the farmhouse, the channels rested, their work complete for the season. Stone held the memory of warmth, even as the need for it faded. Systems, she knew, did not disappear when not in use. They waited. The community began preparing for next winter, almost without realizing it. Repairs were made with different intentions now. Chimneys were rebuilt shorter. Fireplaces were reshaped to burn slower. Stone was gathered not for decoration, but for purpose. People asked different questions, not how to produce more heat, but how to keep what they already had. The language had changed. Eleanor heard phrases that would have sounded strange a year earlier. Let it warm slowly. Don't shock the stone. Give the heat somewhere to go. These ideas passed from neighbor to neighbor, altered slightly each time, but intact at their core. She did not claim credit. Knowledge, she believed, belonged to whoever was willing to carry it forward. One afternoon, Thomas Avery stopped by again, this time without hesitation. He stood where the smoke used to vanish in winter, looking down at bare ground now, the stones exposed and unremarkable in the spring light. I keep thinking about that first morning, he said quietly, when I followed the smoke. Eleanor joined him, resting her hands on the fence. Curiosity is a strange thing, she replied. It waits until it is needed, he nodded. I used to think progress meant doing things faster, bigger fires, bigger houses, stronger materials. He glanced toward her farmhouse. Turns out it just meant listening better. They stood in silence, watching the land settle into its new season. By the time summer came, the farmhouse looked no different than it ever had. No chimney had been added. No visible changes announced its importance. And yet it had altered the way people thought about shelter, about heat, about winter itself. When the first cold wind of the following year brushed the fields, no one laughed. People watched their smoke more carefully now. They noticed how it behaved, how much heat it carried away. They adjusted, experimented, learned. Eleanor's system was no longer unique. It had become a reference point, a quiet standard, rather than an anomaly. On the first truly cold night of the new winter, Eleanor lit her fire again. The smoke entered the channels as it always had, obedient and patient. Beneath the house, warmth began its slow journey, filling stone and wood and earth with what they had been waiting to hold. Outside, other fires burned differently than before. Chimneys smoked less violently. Houses held their warmth longer. People slept deeper. The smoke behind Eleanor's farmhouse drifted low across the ground, but now it carried no questions with it, only understanding. The farmhouse still had no fireplace. It never would. It did not need one, because long after winter returned and long after memory tried to fade, the land would remember what had been relearned. That heat, when respected, stayed.